Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is, yes, we have finally arrived. The French Revolution, the granddaddy of them all, as far as European history goes. Now, as always, take a moment, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, here's the thing. Most of you know that I've taught U.S. history in the past, and to me, the U.S., the American Revolution is kind of a straightforward event. Like, yeah, there's a lot of interplay between the Tories and the Whigs, and there's a lot of confusion early on. But once the war starts, while, yeah, we suffered defeat after defeat under Washington, we survive, and it keeps on going. We fight and we win. The French Revolution is not that. Not whatsoever. In fact, they actually break up the French Revolution into kind of three sections. There's the Age of Montesquieu, the Age of Rousseau, and the Age of Voltaire. And again, named for the three Enlightenment thinkers about kind of the direction or idea of how France became run. I think the big difference, though, and what makes the French Revolution so different than the American Revolution is that, yeah, there's fighting, there's going to be warfare, but they aren't fighting for independence. They're fighting just to change what they have. Now, if you want the American, U.S. analogy to that, that would be, well, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention, the men get together to say, okay, so what we have thus far, the Articles of Confederation, is not working. How can we change this? Now, if that had turned into a bloody battle of shooting and death and famine and cutting people's heads off, then that would be analogous to the French Revolution. The French Revolution, on the other hand, the problem part of it is it's not that everyone knows change is needed. Like, everyone understands, okay, we need change. Most people agree on that. The question they don't agree on, the answer they don't agree on is how much change, what type of change, and how far are you willing to go to get that change? And because that answer is not static, that changes over time, it also changes based on your class. So whether you're a peasant or whether you are a third estate merchant or you're a second estate nobleman or you're a clergy or you're the part of the royal family. And it honestly makes the French Revolution very confusing. And I'm going to do the best I can here, okay, to try to simplify the main narrative of the French Revolution. And we're going to do it in two parts. You see this title is French Revolution 1. There will also be, of course, then a French Revolution Part 2. But I do want to get started today with just talking about why are we even getting to the point we're talking about a revolution in France. And that, of course, has to do with the idea of what's called the Ancien Regime. And, of course, it goes back to Louis XV, so the old regime. Now, under Louis XIV, of course, France became awesome, right? The Versailles Palace. Louis XIV was an absolutist monarch who refused any Enlightenment ideals because he had no time for, Enlightenment thoughts of, social contracts or treating people better. And he had successfully gained absolutist control in large part by controlling the nobles. Under Louis XV, though, you see a picture on your screen, he and his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, under Louis XV's reign, the monarchy begins to lose power because the nobility begins to regain their influence. This is caused by a number of reasons. One of which, though, is the fact that, good old poor Louis over there has got a problem. Both his ministers and his mistresses, they exercise undue influence upon him. They are actually controlling state affairs. They're undermining the prestige of the monarchy. And the example there is Madame de Pompadour. She's the most famous mistress of the 18th century, who will actually influence Louis XV into making important government decisions and giving advice on appointments and foreign policy. So why does this matter? Well, the High Court of Paris, known as the Parlement. Now, this is not Parliament, this is Parlement. It's Parlement. You should know this. This is going to play a very important role in today's lecture. So, the High Court of Paris, known as the Parlement, was restored. And again, think of this as a type of Congress or Parliament. They're restored with the power to approve or disapprove of the king's decrees. Now, this is being done in direct relationship or direct correlation with the questionable advice that Louis is following. I mean, he's literally being told by his lovers to do things in exchange for, I'm assuming, well, more extramarital affairs. If that wasn't bad enough, Louis runs into a cash problem. Remember the War of Austrian Succession that led to the 7 Years' War in Europe? Well, Louis needs to raise taxes to pay for this, and Parliament refuses. And thus the French kings in the 18th century will suffer a similar struggle to the taxation issues of James and Charles I in England from 100 years prior. Remember in the early 1600s when they're trying to raise funds and Parliament refuses, and that's what leads to the English Civil War. That's what's happening in France now 100 years later. And it just keeps getting worse for Louis. He appoints a new chancellor who basically tells him, yeah, you need to stop this whole opposition thing. And again, it's bad advice because what it is, it's just stroking his own ego. To the point where the Parliament of Paris is abolished. Its members are exiled and isolated into extreme provinces. And he begins to tax the nobles once again. Well, when Louis XV dies, Louis XVI comes in, and good old Louis XVI, he is going to reinstate the old Parliament of Paris. Again, he does so hoping for some, again, it's a noble gesture is what it is, right? See, he knows there's lots of turmoil. They're questioning his authority as king. And so as a kind of a token symbol of, yeah, sure, I'm committed to doing good things, he does restore the old Parliament of Paris. And although the public had hoped it would lead to reforms in a more representative government, public would ultimately be disappointed because basically, despite the reinstatement of it, King Louis XVI just ignores it. Now, you guys all know me by now. I'm not a big fan of just talking about politics. And to me, I find it incredibly boring if you don't talk about how it actually changes things on the ground. And so what we talked about so far is the view from the top. France in 1789, the view from the top. But on the ground in France in 1789, France was in many ways one of the most advanced countries of the 18th century. Nearly 25 million people, it's the largest country in the world. It is the wealthiest country in Europe per capita. And it had an extremely productive economy that exported more products than Britain. And of course, French culture was second to none, considered. But of course, they still existed in the three-estate system. That's a holdover from medieval France. You're talking, 500 years now. This is a holdover of no change of this three-estate system. You have the clergy in the first estate with less than 1% of the population, but they own 20% of the land. The problem with this, of course, is a few things. One is the just inequality of it. But more importantly, they are exempt from taxes. And most of local church raising funds income goes not to the local areas, but to the political appointees and high-ranking aristocrats back in the larger cities. And the other problem is, part of the church, of course, if you guys know anything about Christian church, is there's what's called the tithe. You're supposed to give 10% of your income, wherever it is, whether it's crops growing or whether it's physical dollars, give it under the church for God. It's of course it's given to God, but you're given to the church as a way to sustain the church itself and be productive. Well, that's one tax that's being levied against lower estates. The second estate was nobility. Nobility was only about 2 to 4% of the population, and they owned 25% of the land. So you notice so far, 20% of the land is owned by 1% the church, 25% is owned by 2% the nobles. And once again, they are exempt from taxation. And while under Louis XIV, they kind of suffered a decline, under Louis XV, they had risen back to their status. And they still enjoyed manorial rights going back to the medieval period that allowed them to tax peasants for their own profit. Again, so peasants are being taxed on the tithe, the church. They're being taxed by King Louis for whatever taxes he raises, and they're being taxed by their local nobles under the manorial system. And then there's the third estate. The problem with the third estate, as we're going to find out, is there's a big diversity in the third estate. And so there are some bourgeois, wealthy merchants and skilled workers that are professionals. There's also some middle class. There are some city workers who are not peasants. They live in the cities and they're poorly paid, but at least they are able to eat. And then there's the peasants, who are 80% of your population, who are farmers and own very little land. The problem is, this group is bearing the brunt. Right? This is 97% of the population. And they're the ones paying all the taxes. Not the wealthy people, but these poor people. And they're paying a multitude of taxes. I'm going to list 6 of them off for you here. They have the land tax called the taille, T-A-I-L-L-E, the taille. They have the tithe, the 10% of your annual income of the church. They have your income tax. They have a poll tax. They have a salt tax. And they have all these taxes going to the second state directly. And of course, they have any other manorial taxes that are added to it at random times. That's the 6th tax. Now, technically speaking, they do own about 40% of the land. But to offset that gain, you would think, the nobles also instituted the corvée system. The corvée system was a forced labor system where even though you were a landowner, you were still forced to go work for nobles for a certain number of days every year. In addition, despite the fact they owned 40% of the land, nobles enjoyed what was called hunting rights. So even though peasants were not allowed to go on to noble land, nobles could go on to peasant-owned land and hunt for, game. Again, they have that authority on this old medieval idea. And what happens here is the peasants themselves are not even the initial part of this. The group that is really instrumental in getting into the starting the whole French Revolution is the bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois, because they are wealthy merchants and skilled workers who have money, they begin to demand both political and social power to be congruent with their emergent economic power. So they are economically on par with the nobility. In many cases, they are almost as wealthy as the nobility. They are a middle class, right? They're rising up. But their social and political power has been thwarted by the estate system that's, again, 500 years old. So what they want ultimately is they want reduction of privileges for the nobles, or better for them. They also want tax relief for themselves. Now, they're not talking about the city workers. They're not talking about the peasants here. They're just talking about themselves. And so ultimately, what does cause the French Revolution? Well, traditional view is that the bourgeois, they are united by economic interests, and thus class is being thwarted, and the third estate is going to rise up. That's kind of the generic view. The third estate rises up. But as we're going to see, it's not that simple. Because it's not the third estate rising up, it's the bourgeois. And then later on, other groups challenging that, saying, well, if you're getting power, we deserve it too. And the revisionist, more modern historians have looked and questioned the existence of this social conflict between the bourgeois and the noble nobility. Because both groups were actually very similar. So what were the causes then? Well, long term is the breakdown of the Ancien regime. That is one of the largest issues, is that from Louis XIV to Louis XV, Louis XVI, there's a huge breakdown. In addition, there's some influence of the American Revolution, thinking, wow, these ideas might, turn over the tyranny of a tyrant leader. That might be a thing. But ultimately, one of the big things, the two biggest things, comes down to taxation and representation. Yes, I said it. Because taxation, huge debt, becomes a problem. Because the French have been at war for years, right? There was, of course, the 7 Years' War, hugely taxing. Of course, they lost big time in that war. They lost their colonies in North America. Well, then during the American Revolution, France is going to heavily support the Americans. And that support, while instrumental, of course, we celebrate that as Americans, was incredibly costly for the French. And of course, the French don't do it necessarily to help us. They do it just to spite Britain, to hurt Britain. And so this leads to massive debt, which leads to taxation. Again, huge debt, massive taxation is going to cause people to want to rebel. And the second reason, big thing, is the representation issue. Because there was no representative assembly in France. Unlike the Parliament, which was somewhat representative, unlike the United States, which there had House of Representatives, there was these political theories of Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu. The idea that there's rising expectations to a government to be more responsive to the people as a result of the Enlightenment. And so there's these two big issues that are directly related: representation, caused by a financial burden and also an Enlightenment legacy. And there's the massive debt causing more taxation. And then when you apply this to other smaller things that build, such as laissez-faire economics, that are being thwarted by the continued mercantilism of the French government. You add to it the legal system that was not uniform, that we talked about how it did get some reforms in Eastern Europe, not in France. So let me sum it up for you in short. The three-estate system did not reflect the realities of the wealth and ability of French society. In other words, the bourgeois, in their minds, deserved more. They had the economic means to demand it, but they were lacking the political and social equality. Now, in the short term, of course, what's ultimately going to cause it is a few big things. And again, you see on your screen, it's financial mismanagement. During the reign of Louis XVI, not only was the war the issue of, the American Revolution support, debt, but both Louis and his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette, had bankrupt France. By the 1780s, France's annual budget went entirely almost on paying just interest on the debt. So what gives here? And the funny part is, I say this is a huge debt, but the reality is the debt burden of France was only half of Britain's. If you break it down per capita, because remember, France is a much larger country, the debt burden on France is only 1/5 per capita compared to Great Britain. So what gives here? Well, traditionally, the French government, if they were in financial trouble like this, they would just declare bankruptcy, which means when you declare bankruptcy, oh, we're out of money, we can't repay the debt, so sorry, you all loaned us money, but we're not paying you, right? That's the idea of debt, or of bankruptcy. In the past, that had worked. In the 1780s, 1790s, the bourgeois and aristocratic creditors would not allow their loans to be repudiated. And therefore, the only way for the government to regain this revenue, pay off their debt, was to raise taxes. And the government, especially in France, is completely dependent upon the third estate lower classes. And so during this period, we're going to see tremendous inflation, where not only are the huge debt burden of the third estate for taxation, but now their money's not going as far as it did before because of high inflation. This kind of becomes the final straw that's going to push us into revolution. And so in 1787, hoping to stave off major problems, Louis XVI summons what's called the Assembly of Notables. Now, the Assembly of Notables in 1787 is brought in hoping that they would either A, approve new taxes for the peasants, or B, consent to remove the nobles' tax exemptions. So in other words, either let us tax the third estate more, or let us tax you, the nobles, more at all, because you're exempt right now. And of course, the nobles refused both to be taxed themselves, big surprise, and refused to allow new taxes on the peasantry because they want to tax the peasantry themselves. And so the nobles refused it, and they actually demanded that if they were to give more taxation to the peasants, that they would have to be in control then of all future tax decisions. That they must be given the purse, so to speak. Sound familiar to Britain? Louis refused and dismisses the nobles from the Assembly of Notables and established new taxes by decree. These same nobles, though, dominated the parliaments. They began to block tax increases, as well as any new tax, in an attempt to force the king to share his power. Now, the king tries to exile the judges, but protests rise up in response to this. So let me recap this for you. Louis has debt. He needs to pay it off. He calls an assembly of notables. They say, okay, we're not going to let you tax us because we're nobles. We might let you tax the peasants, but you must let us first have control over all future taxation questions. He refuses, disbands them. That parliament that he had brought back, they also refuse to give in to Louis' demands unless they share power with the king. He refuses and tries to raise taxes by himself. This will cause uprisings in protests across France by 1787, 1788. Now, finally, on July 5th, 1788, the king reluctantly summons for what's called the Estates General. This becomes the turning point. Because when he assembles the Estates General, that we'll talk about in a second, it ironically, because by forcing the summoning of the Estates General, the nobility under Louis XVI has unwittingly initiated the revolution. This becomes the point of no return. Because the Estates General, this is a feudal, again, this is still based on feudalism. It was a feudal assembly that represented the three estates. They only met twice in history, in 1302, its inception, and in 1614. Now, in this case, the king asked that all parties study the tax situation, the debt problem, and make proposals on the organization of the states under the more modern condition. In other words, Louis recognized, okay, we have an antiquated system. We need, let me move my picture up so you can see Avisaez here. He understands that this is a problem. And each estate is called, leaders from each of the three estates is called together to meet in the Estates General. And they are supposed to put forth proposals on how to modernize and to effectively tax to pay off this debt. Well, there were some common agreements among the three estates. Number one, France should become a constitutional monarchy. This whole absolutist thing sucks. Constitutional monarchy is where it's at. Individual liberties guaranteed by law. So basically a Bill of Rights. Position of the parish clergy had to be improved. In other words, stop taking all the money, you siphoning the money from local parishes to the capital. And we want more laissez-faire economics, abolition of internal trade barriers. This becomes the four cornerstones that all agree on. And everyone seems to agree. The problem they have is even though excitement begins to flow through France over the course of this year, we're going to have the first election in 300 years as people are going to vote finally. But even though they agree, hey, voting's great, even though they agree on these four general principles, again, constitutional monarchy, individual liberties guaranteed by law, better condition for local parishes, clergy, and abolition of internal trade barriers, what they don't agree on is how the Estates General should vote. Because traditionally, each estate gets one vote. So this is a best of three. There's three estates, each gets one vote, each estate gets one vote, best of three. And they can't decide on, should it be unanimous? Must it be unanimous? Should it be more representative where, the third estate constitutes 96% of the population? How do they get one vote? That's not fair. And then also, who gets to vote among each estate? Is it 25 years and older? Shouldn't the third estate get more representation because they have much larger population? And despite all this ideas of, hey, we're moving toward democracy here a little bit, or at least a constitutional monarchy, none of it mattered. All the excitement, all the hope was immediately crushed because the Parliament of Paris, the nobles, they ruled that the voting in the Estates General would follow the old tradition. Each estate gets one vote, which means if you are the clergy of the first estate, you're the nobles of the second estate, are you ever going to agree with pretty much anything the third estate says? So even though you represent 3 to 4% of the population, you two can band together and usurp any ideas of greater equality of the third estate. Whether it regards representation, taxation, do you think nobles and the clergy are going to say, oh yeah, you should tax us? No, because they enjoy financial benefit. And thus the first and second estates are going to control the Estates General because they have similar interests to protect despite the increased size of the third estate. Now, one of the most influential writers of the third estate is a man by the name of Abbé Sieyès, as you see on your screen. And he begins to write and publish ideas based on Rousseau's social contract. He states that the third estate should have all the power in France, that the stratified stated nobility should be abolished. And so all of this takes place at this election, this defeat for the third estate, the writings of Abbé Sieyès, all in the midst of the worst depression of the 18th century in France. So all this hope and change that people are looking for, it seems to be there, only to come crashing down with a decision of the Parliament of Paris that said each estate gets one vote. Thus, the third estate is not going to see any tangible benefit because the first two estates are going to vote in their own self-interest to protect their own privileges. And in the midst of all this is the biggest depression of the century. The economy tanks, there's grain shortages, there's poor harvests, and the bread prices are greatly inflated. Now, on May 5th, 1789, the Estates General will meet. The third estate is furious that the voting method by the estates was not per capita, based on population. Each estate was ordered to meet separately. The third estate refused and insisted that the Estates General, that they all vote together. After 6 weeks deadlock, a 6-week deadlock followed this meeting in May 5th, 1789, until the Third Estate would assert their power in June. And then we get to as you see in the dates here, what's called the Tennis Court Oath. But we'll discuss that. So this has all been the setup for the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution officially will begin in 1789, and we will talk about that in our next lecture, the actual beginning of the revolution itself. Up to this point, it's just, here's the reasons, here's what leads to this. In other words, they are incapable of change. Reform is needed, and it's going to take a revolution to try to force it. But until then, take care, and bye-bye.